Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine by Jeff Halper. The subtitle is Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. And really, Halper does this in that exact order. He talks about what Zionism was, he talks about settler colonialism, and he goes through talking about a one democratic state. I have to tell you, when I started this journey many months ago, I didn't really realize there was a one democratic state movement. I'd always heard of the two-state solution. That's what all of us who were told, who only superficially follow the what's going on in Palestine. And it's the solution that has the most international recognition. But as he points out, and as I'll quote later on, the Israelis are not interested in the two-state solution. So that's not really, it doesn't matter how many people approve of it if the Israelis don't approve of it. So you have to find something that the Israelis are going to support. And now, are they going to support one democratic state? That's another issue, but there's practical reasons for it, and we'll get to that argument. But we're probably just going to start out the way that I always do, by going through what Halper is talking about to get us ready to, I would say in the latter part of this review, in which I go through the thought experiments. And there's not time to go through every point that he brings up as to here's an objection and here are some answers. That's why I want you to read the book. That's why we always do these reviews, is read the book yourself. But I just want to highlight a few things. So who is Jeff Halper? He's an Israeli Jew, and he's someone who came to Israel and realized what happened later. And he calls himself a colonist who refuses. Should I simply leave, as some suggest, or focus on changing Israeli society, policies, and attitudes? The path I chose, I became a co-resistor, a junior partner in a joint Palestinian-Israel struggle for decolonization. So he's a settler who refuses. So someone, and he was part of the organization that worked against home demolitions. So they would be there to protest against the demolition of a home. And once a home had been demolished, they would then help to rebuild it. And I think they rebuilt over 200 homes. It's a wonderful, right on the ground action. I think a real act of resistance, and something that should be applauded. So then what is settler colonialism? Now, Halper makes the point, quite rightly, that this is quite an academic term, and so people sometimes get turned off by it, but he tries to make it a bit clearer and tries to make a bit more sense of it, which I think is useful. And the idea in its simplest form is a people who move to another land to displace the native population, not to live in peace with the native population, not to share with the native population equally, but to take over, displace the population, potentially exterminate the population, or make them their slaves. And this is settler colonialism. Obviously, we recognize that in a number of places. And there are different solutions that it can come to, and one could be a draw. The settler, so he gives different situations. Here, the settlers and the indigenous have arrived at a draw. The former, that is the settlers, are strong enough to establish a state of their own and marginalize the latter, but are not strong enough to decisively defeat them. For their part, the indigenous are strong enough to mount a major challenge to settler dominance, preventing the triumph the settler state realized over Fourth World peoples. Even if they should succeed in overthrowing the settler regime, however, as in fact happened in South Africa, they cannot expel the settler population, which is too large and embedded. Decolonization in this case is only partly achieved by the rise of a new polity, so a new political state. And we'll get into that, how that might come about. So we're dealing with a settler colonialist case, and one in which the Zionists proudly called, there were companies called, the colonial company or colonial venture, or anything related to this. It was very much seen as that. We're going to bring Europe here. We're going to be a bulwark against the barbarous hordes of Asia. So it was always seen as a colonial project. Just that the problem is colonialism has become, quote unquote, unpopular or politically incorrect now. So the Jews will now backpedal. The Zionists will say, oh, it wasn't really a colonialist movement. So this is from Ze'ev Jabotinsky in his piece, The Iron Wall, in 1923. Every native population, civilized or not, regards its lands as its national home, of which it is the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, but even new partners or collaborators. This is equally true of the Arabs. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable, but they know what we want, as well as we know what they do not want. They feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and the Sioux for the rolling prairies. Where the Aztecs, that's a different conversation for another time. They are not people who are sacrificing child virgins, are not people who I was particularly cared about defending their rights and enslaving all of the people around them. But there is a general point to be made there. All right, Israel's establishment. The settlers, nearly all of them, and we're talking about during the 1930s, okay? Settlers, nearly all of them young people with ties to the labor movement, would arrive at a site, build a fence around the land, and erect a watchtower, which is why these settlements were called Homa Umigdal, or stockade and tower. At first, they were meant to prevent Arab farmers from continuing to work land bought by the Zionist movement, but the Homa Umigdal system also allowed the settlers to feel patriotic and rebellious, as if they were engaged in secret military operations, although the British allowed it. So sometimes they would do this at night, as if they were doing some special operations activity. Jewish labor could not compete with the low wages paid to Arabs. The Moshavat could not afford to pay Jewish workers what their level of subsistence required. Faced with this dilemma, the Zionist leadership came up with the idea of the kibbutz. Then once you started to have these social projects where people live together and work together, you don't have to worry about wages, this sort of room and board situation. Then you need to cleanse the area, and that means getting rid of the Arabs. So even if these are tenant farmers who worked the land for many years, the Jews would expel them under the principle of avoda ivrit, which is Hebrew labor. Now, I point out to people all the time, if they bought the land, the Jews had the legal right to expel those Arab farmers, and they may even have had a moral right, because if you have your own children who you want to work the land, and it's your land and you own it, you have a moral right to displace those people. However, it should be said, even if you have a legal right to do something and a moral right to do something, you have to understand what are the circumstances that are going to accrue, which is you're going to have a bunch of landless people, resentful, roaming around the countryside. And that's going to lead to problems. So you can't just expel people from their homes of centuries, even if you have a moral and legal right to do so, and think that nothing bad is going to happen. And that pressure built up to the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939. So this cleansing leads to something called Judaization. It's a term frequently used since the start of Zionism. It continues to be used by the Israeli government, as in the policy of, quote, Judaizing the Galilee, although less contentious terms like redeeming the land, Geulat Haaretz, are preferred. In either case, the clear intention is to transform an Arab country into a Jewish one. And here, as I said, by the 1920s, resentment and resistance had ignited ever more organized resistance, leading to the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. Both Judaization and de-Arabization proved violent processes, inevitable expressions of colonization. Moshe Sharet says in 1914 he would go on to become a prime minister. We have forgotten that we have not come to an empty land to inherit it, but we have come to conquer a country from a people inhabiting it, that governs it by virtue of its language and savage culture. Recently, there has been appearing in our newspapers the clarification about the mutual understanding between us and the Arabs about common interests and about the possibility of unity and peace between the two fraternal peoples. But we must not allow ourselves to be deluded by such elusive hopes. For if we seek to look upon our land, the land of Israel, as ours alone, and we allow a partner into our estate, all content and meaning will be lost to our enterprise. So this is something important to realize about the Zionist vision is they cannot be happy with a state for the Jews. They must have a Jewish state. And that is why, even if you do have Palestinians that live there, they must be second-class citizens, because that wouldn't be true to the vision of the Jewish state. Not a state for Jews, but a Jewish state. You have to understand the difference. One is constituted specifically for them, and everyone else are sort of invaders and will tolerate you, as opposed to, oh, well, we happen to be the majority in this country. And that's one of the things Halper addresses in this book is, in order for this to happen, the Zionist project will have to end. It will have to end in failure, but it doesn't mean that Israeli Jews couldn't potentially live in the new state, whatever it would be called. Disappearing the Arabs lay at the heart of the Zionist dream, writes Tom Segev, who we've done a review, One Palestine Complete. I'll put a card up to that. Was also a necessary condition of its realization. With few exceptions, none of the Zionists disputed the desirability of forced transfer or its morality. There's also what was happening during the mandate. This is ground that we've covered in other videos. If you're curious about it, as I said, One Palestine Complete, if you want to understand how the state of Israel got so much momentum during the British mandate times, that would be the book to read. And this mentions some of the franchises that they got. The Palestine Electric Company served only Jews. The Palestine Potash Company had an exclusive right to mine the minerals of the Dead Sea. The British also paid Jewish government workers higher salaries than the Arabs. So they also allowed the Jews to bring in unlimited capital. The influx of Jewish capital in the 1920s was 41% greater than the Yeshuv's entire economy. So they were given tremendous economic advantages in able to put together the infrastructure and the feeling of a state. And this was denied to the Palestinians. There's also the idea of Israel always being on a war footing. We're seeing this particularly in the post-October 2023 cycle between Palestine, particularly Gaza, and Israel, that reservists are having to stay on the front lines for a long time. IDF Chief of Staff Yigal Yadin put it, every Jewish citizen is a soldier on 11 months annual leave. So the idea is this is forever, apparently, but it only has to be forever if you don't make a lasting peace. And in order to not make a lasting peace, you have to blame the other party as saying, well, they don't want peace, as if they want to be at war forever. That's a crazy idea, but we're supposed to believe it. So what are some of these policies and laws that were adopted by the new state of Israel, which, by the way, did not have a constitution and didn't say what its borders were. And to this day, it still doesn't. Why? Because Israel always wants to expand. If it were to say that these are borders, it wouldn't give them the opportunity to seize more land in war, which is what they still have as their vision. What they have is a minimum. The current position that they're holding, in de facto possession of the Golan Heights and the West Bank and Gaza, these are minimums for them. They would like to occupy a whole lot more. They just are waiting for the right moment to that. So here are some new laws that were added. First of all, they adopted all of the laws of the British Mandate, which the Jews had so bitterly criticized as anti-democratic and even Nazi-like before May the 15th, 1948, except they adopted all 170 of those mandatory statutes. They added to them Law and Administration Ordinance Number 1, which declared the country to be in a national state of emergency, in which it remains until this day. Can you imagine? From 1948 till now and potentially forever. This suspended much of due process. Article 125 allowed local governors to declare any area of the country a forbidden or closed area, which no one can enter or leave without a written permit from the military commander or his deputy, failing which he is considered to have committed a crime. In this way, the Arab communities of the country were divided into small, closed areas, severely limiting movement. And we saw that accelerate after Oslo, where a number of places were considered closed military zones. This is still being used in the West Bank to this very day and hour as a way to deny grazing lands to Palestinians for their animals and say, oh, this is a closed zone, you have to leave, or you're committing a crime. Article 124 empowered the military authorities to impose a curfew in any area for any length of time. Articles 122 and 126 empowered the military governor to prevent the use of specific roads or roads in general. Article 109 gave the military government the power to banish people or hold them under house arrest for an unspecified period without legal recourse. Article 111, commonly used today in the occupied territories, allows administrative detention of any person for a year, renewable, with no charges or trial. Articles 94 and 96 forbid the printing of newspapers or any document containing matter of political significance without a permit. Article 108 empowered the military governor to do whatever necessary for securing the public safety, the defense of Israel, the maintenance of public order, or the suppression of mutiny, rebellion, or riot. Arab citizens were tried in military courts whose decisions, in accordance with Articles 34, 46, 47, 48, and 50, could not be appealed, including sentences of life imprisonment and even death. So, there's more. So what happens after 1967? There's more laws. Military Order 59, for example, grants the Israeli custodian of abandoned properties the authority to declare uncultivated land as Israeli state land. Order 270 designates a further million dunams, roughly 250,000 acres, of West Bank land as closed combat zones, which are then handed over to settlers or Israeli infrastructure. Order 363 imposes severe restrictions on construction and land use in yet other areas zoned as nature reserves. Order 393 grants any military commander in Judea and Samaria, that's what the Zionists call the West Bank, the authority to prohibit Palestinian construction to ensure the security of the Israeli army or public order. Hundreds of other military orders effectively curb the development of Arab communities, alienate land from its Palestinian owners, and impose a draconian system of control and punishment. And more. Military Order 107 bans publications, including works on Arabic grammar, histories of the Crusades, and studies of Arab nationalism. Military Order 998 requires Palestinians to get Israeli military permission to make a withdrawal from their bank account. I mean, you really can't make it up. And when we're talking about the ethnic cleansing, obviously there's that review I did on the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. I can put a card for that video. But here's a long quote from that text talking about mapping the villages ahead of time. There was a list of everyone who had been involved in the revolt and the families of those who had lost someone in the fight against the British. Particular attention was given to people who had allegedly killed Jews. These reports included the basic structure of the Arab village. This means the structure and how best to attack it. Files in the post-1943 era included detailed descriptions of the husbandry, the cultivated land, the number of trees in plantations, the quality of each fruit grove, even of each single tree, the average amount of land per family, the number of cars, shop owners, members of workshops, and the names of the artisans in each village and their skills. Meticulous detail was added about each clan and its political affiliation, the social stratification between notables and common peasants, and the names of the civil servants in the mandatory government. One finds additional details popping up around 1945, such as descriptions of village mosques and the names of their imams, together with such characteristics as he is, quote, an ordinary man, and even precise accounts of the living rooms inside the homes of these dignitaries. So this was then later used as part of the ethnic cleansing operation. They had the data there, and people like Benny Morris are going to say there wasn't a grand conspiracy, but the point is that all of this research had been done and people had been talking about transfer. So you don't necessarily need to give an order for people to take matters into their own hands, and that's what they did. So here is some text. There's the Zionist Declaration of Independence, and there are three assertions that Halper points out flow from this. Firstly, the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here, they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here, they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. Secondly, exiled from Palestine, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of their dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and restoration of their national freedom. 3. Impelled by this historic association, Jews strove throughout the centuries to go back to the land of their fathers and regain statehood. So, and so Halper points out, all three of these assertions have been debunked by historians. So I think particularly the fact that Iraqi Jews did not want to come to Palestine when they were invited. They said, we do not consider ourselves separate from this society. We consider ourselves Iraqi. So If that's true, how can you say that they were never ceasing to hope and pray for the return and restoration of the national home? So this is something that the Zionists are asserting, which ignores the fact that there are plenty of Jews who are happy living many other places in the world. And in fact, today, more than half of Jews, or at least half, if you want to be the most conservative, just say, okay, let's divide in half. Half of the Jews of the world decide not to live in Palestine or in the state of Israel and the occupied territories, even though they would be given a free passport, potentially free housing, subsidies, etc., to come. They choose not to come to Israel, and that should say something to you about these assertions that, oh, Jews were always dreaming of a national home and dreaming of throughout the centuries of coming back. And yet today with jet travel and money and a passport, they don't come back. Why is that? So Zionism does not speak for Jews. It speaks for some Jews. And that's what people have to realize. Separating Zionism from Judaism. To render it unassailable by historic argument, the Zionist narrative asserted that God gave us this land. It was a somewhat cynical claim from militantly secular Zionists and often atheistic Zionists, but effective. Israel's Declaration of Independence ends with the phrase, "with trust in Almighty God," whoever he is. We may not believe in him, but Ilan Pappé always says that Zionists don't believe in God, but they believe that God gave them the land. So Halper also addresses the illegality and unjustness. Let me invert that. The unjustness and the illegality of both the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Resolution, respectively. So the unjustness of the Balfour Declaration saying that there's going to be a Jewish national home in contravention of national self-determination. So the majority population of Palestine should have been able to determine their state as the people in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, other places were allowed to do. This wasn't allowed to happen in Palestine. Even though the British government issued the Balfour Declaration as a diplomatic position paper, it carried with it no legal or political authority. In fact, it was only one of 3 diplomatic documents that Britain negotiated, each with a different promise to the local populations. In the Hussein-McMahon correspondence during World War I, the British agreed to recognize Arab independence after the war if the Sharif of Mecca would launch an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which he did. Lawrence of Arabia, if you want 7 Pillars of Wisdom, I'll put a card to that for you to look at. At the same time, 1916, the British signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, in which they agreed to divide the Ottoman territories between them after the war. By supporting the establishment of a national Jewish home in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration contradicted the other 2. Such a position certainly violated the spirit and the letter of British commitments to the Arabs in general and to the people of Palestine in particular, as the King-Crane Commission made clear. The same could be said for the 1947 UN partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. Given the outspoken opposition of the indigenous Palestinians, 2/3 of the country's inhabitants, partition lacked both moral and legal authority. It lacked moral authority because the UN knew that ethnic cleansing would be the outcome of its decision. The UN knowingly entrusted the fate of an entire people to a settler movement, declaring its exclusive entitlement to the country, and its readiness to employ violent conquest and transfer. Legally, the partition plan contained a fundamental contradiction. If it required a Palestinian state to arise alongside a Jewish one, then Zionism's declared policy of Judaizing by force the entire country, which in fact happened, nullifies it. The international community has continued to legitimize the Zionist settler project, even though it has known full well for 7 decades and more that its agenda is to eliminate a national Palestinian presence in the country. So there's no legitimacy either behind the UN Partition Resolution or the Balfour Declaration, and people have to understand that. David Ben-Gurion, who assumed the leadership of the Jewish Agency, the Zionist government in the making, declared, "This is a decision regarding the national home based on force, a Jewish military decision. We want the land of Israel in its entirety. That was the original intention." And as the kids say these days, he was saying the quiet part out loud. How about some statistics from 1967? Zionism's colonial project took a leap forward in June 1967 when Israel conquered the remaining parts of historic Palestine, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. During the course of the war, 350,000 Palestinians, most of them refugees from the 1948 war, once again left their homes in refugee camps. Most fled to Jordan. After the fighting subsided, 120,000 of them applied to the Israeli authorities to return to their homes, their absolute right under international law. Only 14,000 were allowed to do so. Over the next 2 or 3 years, the Israeli authorities demolished some 8,000 Palestinian homes and imprisoned, deported, or forced the emigration of thousands of residents of the occupied territories in a campaign of de-Arabization that continues until today. And keep in mind, when I keep saying occupation, but you have to realize Israel does not accept the term occupation. Israel has never accepted the legal fact of occupation since it contradicts Zionism's claim of entitlement to the whole of the land of Israel. It also denies the very notion of occupation, which denotes a territory outside of one's own, potentially detachable and subject to negotiations. So occupation would mean we're going to leave someday, and they have no intention to leave. Instead of occupation, here's how they would frame things using Hasbara, which is basically Israeli propaganda, but I call it just explaining. Hasbara is always just explaining how the Zionists are right and everybody else is wrong. The land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. There is no other side in terms of national rights. The Jews are the only legitimate claimants to the land. So if you understand that frame, you understand why would they use the term occupation? That doesn't make any sense to them. In seeming contradiction to the first point, however, Israel needed to set up the Palestinians as a side in a conflict, both to conceal its unilateral settler project and to have a foil upon which to cast blame for the, quote, conflict. By presenting the Arabs as its permanent enemies, Israel established the false symmetry of both sides, upon which conflict management and the illusion of negotiation depends. Hasbara carefully nurtured the image of Israel as the victim fighting for its existence, dovetailing nicely with the Jewish stereotype. Israel's fighting with the Palestinians became a trope for Jews historically fighting for their existence, and becomes heroic, mystic, relating to divine calls. Israel's treatment of Palestinians is an internal matter. Internationals should butt out. And the settler polities stubbornly insist on a capacity to treat indigenous relations as an exclusively internal matter. And this has been opposed by the UN Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I'm sure you can guess Israel did not sign off on. And in fact, what's happening, and I've heard this phrase before, I probably have not brought it up in my reviews yet, but what is actually happening in Gaza and in the occupied territories as well is a de-development. If we think about the development, we talk about the developing world, developing nations. What is actually happening in the Palestinian territories is de-development. And what does that sound and look like? Bringing the Palestinian economy under its control, this is Israel's control, and regulating it closely created a dependency on Israel that it could manipulate. And over time, Israel's economic policy became one of de-development. Palestinian industries and banks were restricted in their activities so as not to compete with Israeli ones. So they can't even compete fair. There's like, we're the chosen people, we're so great, but we have to tie people's hands behind their backs so they can't really compete with us. A third of the Palestinian workforce became casual laborers in Israel or in the growing Israeli settlements. Their work permits depended on, quote, good behavior. Many Palestinians had to find work abroad. Remittances from the Gulf states became a primary source of occupied territory income. Land was progressively lost to settlements, settlement infrastructure and military bases, constricting agriculture. The ban on new construction and Israel's policy of demolishing Palestinian homes worsened housing conditions. By the outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987, economic prosperity had shriveled, and the Palestinians found themselves living under an increasingly repressive regime. The foundation of neoliberal control, the economic equivalent of foundational violence, was the Paris Protocol of 1994, still in effect. Signed as an annex to the Oslo II agreement, the protocol gives Israel control over Palestinian customs and trade, 2/3 of the Palestinian Authority's revenue, and the source of 40% of its spending. Since Israel controlled all the points of entry into the Palestinian territory, it also gave it veto power over imports to and exports from the occupied territories, thus stifling competition from Palestinian firms and keeping Palestine's economy in a depressed state. Israel's ability to withhold millions in VAT and fees owed to the PA has all but destroyed Palestinian commerce. The Paris Protocol also gives Israel control over the licensing of both industrial and commercial Palestinian enterprises, together with the authority to issue import and export permits and stipulate which Israeli import agents, clearing, shipping agents, and insurance agents that Palestinian business people must use. All of this generates high transportation, storage, insurance, and clearance costs. As a result, manufacturing has declined to only 10% of the Palestinian economy. Nearly 90% of industrial enterprises in the occupied territories employ fewer than 5 workers, and 70% of Palestinian firms have either closed or have severely reduced production. Restrictions and trade barriers have also reduced agricultural productivity by 34 to 45%. The economic situation of the occupied territory has reached emergency proportions under this combination of Israeli economic controls and Fayyad's reforms. Fayyad was one of these technocrats that was brought in as a finance minister for the PA, I think. By 2018, unemployment in the West Bank was 31%. In Gaza, which suffered from the highest rate of unemployment in the world, it had reached 52%. Real wages, labor productivity, and labor participation rates all declined. Food insecurity also reached historically high levels, with 1 in 3 households in the occupied territories struggling to put food on the table. 70% of Palestinians, including 2/3 of the children, live on less than $2 a day, defined by the UN as deep poverty. More than 100,000 Palestinians out of the 125,000 who used to work in Israel, in Israeli settlements, or in joint industrial zones have lost their jobs. In the meantime, welfare payments, dependent on tax monies illegally withheld by Israel under the Paris Protocol, have fallen by 180 million. All right, so what is this all leading to? I've been giving you statistics. I've been setting the groundwork. A lot of this we've covered in different reviews of different books. But it's to set us up for this, which he says, what is missing is an endgame. Academics, for all their critical analyses, have not been active participants in translating their powerful theories into political forms of use to activists and decision makers. In particular, they have not partnered with critical activists on the ground to formulate a political endgame, leaving the activists foundering without a political program for which to advocate. One cannot be in a political struggle without an endgame. And this was something that the African National Congress in South Africa did very well. They bypassed both the apartheid government and the white population of South Africa and went directly to the international community, asking for boycotts, asking for sanctions, and saying, at the end of this game, we want one vote, one man, one vote. So everyone gets to vote, which would necessarily bring about a black-run country because they were the majority, and they weren't going to try to convince the apartheid government no longer to be apartheid. They thought they would be able to hold on forever. And as long as they had U.S. support, South Africa was happy for everyone else in the world to abandon them. But as long as they had America, they were going to stay in the game. And how did the Palestinian, the PLO, which became the PA, how did it manifest change over time from learning what was happening? Halper says here, the military confrontation with Jordan in 1970 to 1971 led to the PLO's eviction from that country, and the situation in the occupied territory was calling for more attention, especially given the government in the region towards some kind of settlement following the 1973 war. As shown in the records of PNC meetings, a fundamental shift towards pragmatism began manifesting itself already in mid-1974 and grew stronger over the course of the decade. The outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War, the steady disappearance of Palestinian land as Israel's settlements expanded, particularly after Begin's election in 1977, Egypt's signing of a separate peace plan with Israel in 1979, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, culminating in yet another displacement of the PLO, this time to far-off Tunisia, international isolation, the rising expectation of the residents of the West Bank and Gaza for a Palestinian state, leading to fears of being bypassed by the First Intifada. All of these drove PLO chairman Yasser Arafat to formally accept the two-state solution on November the 15th, 1988, approved by the 18th PNC, Palestinian National Congress. Pressed by these external forces, this is in 1988, the Palestinians were galvanized to cut through their internal ambiguities and to move definitively beyond the struggle between what they believed as just and what they realized was possible. And that's a hard thing. And that's something that is going to have to be decided by the people, not by you or me, other people who are not Palestinian. The Palestinians will have to decide that for themselves, what this looks like. And so what are some of the conditions that Halper and the people who are working for one democratic state in the future, what are some of the things that they bring up? The historic land of Palestine belongs to all who live in it and to those who were expelled or exiled from it since 1948, regardless of religion, ethnicity, national origin, or current citizenship status. The implementation of the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants in accordance with UN Resolution 194 is a fundamental requirement for justice and a benchmark of equality. It also signifies Palestinian national sovereignty, the ability to address one's people's needs with a significant measure of self-determination. Any system of government must be founded on the principle of equality in civil, political, social, and cultural rights for all citizens. The regime of ethno-religious nationalism should be replaced by a constitutional democracy based on common citizenship, thus enabling and fostering the emergence of a shared civil society. And these points go on and on. I'm not going to read them all here, but just to give you a bit of a flavor of what are some of the things that will have to be laid out. And if that's done, and if one democratic state gains popular momentum among the Palestinians, the argument for it is one state already exists de facto. Israel is the state. What has to happen is the Zionists have to be wrenched from control. It's the same thing. South Africa's borders didn't have to be redrawn. It was the apartheid government that had to be overthrown and a new government put in its place. What about religion? Because people are going to say Arafat said that he wanted Islam to be the only religion permitted and that Sharia law would be the law of Palestine. And again, that's something that Palestinians and whoever the citizens of this future one democratic state would have to resolve. But here's Halper's comment. This is a fundamental issue that will have to be decided in the future. The one democratic state program adopts the PLO's position of non-sectarian government. Its vision of the new state is secular in the sense that the authority to govern and make laws emanates from the consent of the governed and not from religious law. And there is no official religion, although religious laws may still function alongside civil institutions. Since the term secular has so many connotations, mostly negative to religious people, and since the majority of Palestinians and Israelis alike describe themselves as religious or traditional, our strategy, like that of the PNC, is to advocate a non-sectarian democracy while refraining from using the red flag term secular. Now, I do think that all secular democracies are doomed to failure. So I'm not advocating for it. Obviously, I'm a Catholic royalist. I have my own particular views. But what is relevant for the Palestinians is this: if you're dealing with such a contentious situation, you can have religious tolerance as a way to live together, not as an ideal, not as something to be looked to as, oh, this is such a great situation. Both sides will be unhappy, potentially all sides. I mean, Christianity would be one of those sides that don't want to exclude Palestinian Christians from this discussion. But tolerance would be a way that the society could move forward together. And again, that's for Palestinians to decide, not for us to decide. But it needs to be part of a political action plan, which activists can relate back to and say, well, what's going to happen? Well, we've been discussing this, and that's something that has to be worked out by the Palestinians. That's a self-determination. And I've also come to realize over time that the two-state solution is much more, and this is said much more eloquently than I could have said it. It appears the two-state solution is less useful as a plan for, quote, resolving the conflict, this is the Israeli government, than it is a mechanism of conflict management. What is the point of the two-state solution? It's conflict management. It's not resolving the conflict. Because ideally, again, Zionists want all of the land and they want all the Palestinians to leave. It was Moshe Dayan who said, you all will live as dogs. We have no solution. Those who want to will leave, and we'll see what happens. And that's still the situation until today. Now, Halper also says, why bring up the two-state solution? Yes, it's the one that's most internationally recognized, but as I said in the beginning of the review, this is not something that the Israelis agree to. So it doesn't matter if everyone in the whole world agrees to it if the Israelis don't agree to it. So the objection is put forward. The two-state solution works and has been accepted by the international community. Why abandon it now? Halper answers, had it been implemented, the two-state solution might have worked, even if it wasn't fair. Palestinians would have had a viable sovereign, if small, state on 22% of historic Palestine. Refugees could have come back, albeit into a small state. The Palestinian state would have had borders with both Israel and two Arab countries, Jordan and Egypt, as well as a seaport and airport in Gaza. The international community, of course, accepted the two-state solution already in 1967. The PLO officially accepted it in 1988, before Oslo, and in 2002 the Arab League did as well. But Israel rejected it. Israel's governments, going back to 1967, have rejected the notion of a viable sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. They even reject the very fact of occupation. Instead, Israel annexed East Jerusalem and moved 700,000 settlers into the territory that would have been a Palestinian state. It confined 95% of the Palestinians to the tiny islands of areas A and B in the West Bank, and it besieged Gaza. In January 2020, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that Israel would annex the Jordan Valley and all the settlements in accord with Trump's deal of the century, without even offering the annexed Palestinians Israeli citizenship. Nor is there any will on the part of the international community to sanction Israel or force it to withdraw from the occupied territory. So true, while the two-state solution may have worked, it was never accepted by Israel. Regardless, it is now dead and gone, buried under massive settlement blocks. We must move on. So not just buried under massive settlement, buried under the bodies of all these children that have been murdered over the years. Jews and Arabs hate each other and can never live together in peace. Such sweeping ahistorical assertions are never useful or accurate. So again, I'll just read a couple of these points. Palestine, like the rest of the Middle East, had long been multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. Despite very occasional exceptions, Jews have lived in Arab and Muslim countries far more securely than in Europe. The very basis for the persecution of Jews, anti-Semitism based on the enmity of Christianity to Judaism, is missing in the Arab-Muslim world. I don't know that I entirely associate myself with that statement, but I think the point is still made. Jews and Muslims lived shared, if communally separate, lives. So they lived together in peace. We have the evidence for this. So whatever the attitude of Islam towards Judaism may be, and you can read it in the Quran if you'd like, it's not nice, but they managed to live together in peace for practical purposes. So the idea that they've always hated each other, maybe at the intellectual level that's true, but in the practical order, they live together. And there's photos from before the British Mandate of them even celebrating holidays together, of Muslim children celebrating Jewish holidays. People don't need reason to celebrate holidays. They always want days off. But that we have photos of this sort of thing happening. So it happened. Whether people like it or not, it happened. You just have to deal with it. In Palestine, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews were integral parts of the indigenous population. Native Palestinian Jews shared not only the Arabic language with the Arab Palestinians, but also memories, cultural traditions, customs, and sense of belonging in relations to the land. From the Palestinian perspective, Jews living in the region were merely another religious community. Having no experience with European nationalism, which, by the way, is a very new phenomenon. Nationalism is a liberal phenomenon that has come very recently in human history. But we were always peoples. We were not always nation states. Having no experience with European nationalism, they could not understand or accept the idea that Jews were a national group which claimed exclusive ownership over their own country, particularly Jews living in Russia, Poland, Britain, and the US. What about the Jews who now live in Palestine? What would they do in a single democratic state? So Halper answers, it is not fair, quote unquote, that Palestinians must be asked to share their country with Israelis. The latter, after all, have denied their national rights and displaced them from their own country and lands, and continue to do so. But it is also an irreversible fact that an Israeli Jewish population will remain, albeit their Israeli Jewish identity incorporated into a broader civil one. that leaves the Palestinians with a challenge. For all the injustices done to them, can they envision a shared life with former Israeli Jews if a new society emerges based on restorative justice? And this is, if you know anything about South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that there can be a process of healing. It is possible, but it's going to require a lot of character on the part of the Palestinians. Can they agree to a shared life with Israeli Jews in a country that is transforming into something entirely different? A country in which colonial structures of domination and control are replaced by universal citizenship and vibrant democratic institutions, where refugees and their descendants are brought home, where resources and land are redistributed to give all citizens equal access, where Palestinians receive compensation for loss of land and property, together with collective reparations for loss of life and productivity, for the effects of traumatization and for lost life opportunities extending over generations, where robust programs of investment and affirmative action in the Palestinian sector are instituted. If the state of Israel managed to get reparation money from Germany and other places, they certainly understand the process in which the Palestinians will impose that upon them. And it's a perfectly just thing to do. And one wrong is not righted by another wrong, which means you're not going to, it's not just to expel the Israeli Jews that are there now in one force to make it ethnically pure Palestinian. Remember that there were Jews living in Palestine prior to 1948, prior to 1917, prior to 1870. There were Jews that had been living there since the time of Christ. So there are Jews that are indigenous to Palestine, but not all Jews are. But there are some that live there now. And if you want to build a single democratic, and I'm realizing now that the shape of this is also matching the Mahmoud Darwish poem back there. But that's something I hope for, is one democratic state as an idea. And I'm starting to grasp it. I still haven't read enough. I've only read some 30 books on the Palestinian-Israel issue. My goal is to read 60 by the end of this year. And once I have, I think I'll be in a better position to quote unquote decide. But in a sense, I don't have to decide because it's not up to me anyway. It's about advocacy and educating people about the possibilities. And I think this book has turned me on to the possibilities of what one democratic state would look like and the challenges that it would have to overcome, but also some of the advantages it could have over a two-state solution. So if you're interested in the arguments of one democratic state, I think this is pretty much the book to get on it. It's not very long, coming in at about 200 pages with endnotes. So Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine by Jeff Halper. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, subscribe, share this with people who are interested in maybe they're interested in the two-state solution and they want to hear something about the other side. One way you can support the channel is by buying the book from the link provided in the description below. You can also support my work even more by becoming a member of my Patreon or YouTube members. You'll get early access to videos like this one. You'll also be able to talk with me about how these videos come together, what I include, what I exclude. If you'd like to suggest books for the future, my Amazon wish list is linked down below. So in 2025 and beyond, you can buy a book from that list and I can potentially review it. And in 2024, a portion of the proceeds from all these various methods of income into the channel, a portion of that is going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. I've linked to that in the description below. You can go there and find out about their work and support them directly. They give medical care to Palestinian children who would not otherwise be able to receive it, or you can support them indirectly by supporting my channel. So consider that. You can also send a super thanks here. That's another way that you can support the channel. As always, enjoy your reading.